We are back with Beyond the Session, the show where your therapist shares stories you were never meant to hear. I asked ChatGPT to give me an engaging intro for a podcast today, and here's what it said. Unlock the door to the therapy lounge and listen as therapists let their guard down. This is some top secret stuff you're hearing today. We're doing part 2 of our series on narrative therapy. In our first episode, we explored internal aspects of how we form personal narratives and the story we tell ourselves. And in today's show, we'll look at externalizing that story and changing our perspective on the story through narrative reconstruction. We started to break into this a little bit at the end of our last episode. I'm curious about what actually happens in a therapy room when people come in and share their stories, and maybe you sense as a therapist that there might be a distortion there, or they're having distress over their story. You talked about how sharing our story is actually very powerful and how it can actually give us a space to be free from the tangled emotions that might be happening with that story. How does that happen in therapy?
I mean, it happens in multiple ways. Sometimes almost kind of serendipitous, right? Like I don't know that I have, because that's the thing about having a multi-pronged approach to things. If you have like multiple tools in your belt, you kind of have to like intuitively know if it's the right time to bring something up or not, or a tool or not, and to ask permission as well, right? Or explain what it is with the clients. So it maybe is part of my personality. That's why it's like that.
Yeah.
So maybe some people have very structured ways of approaching things, like a flow chart diagram that they know exactly, this is when I'm supposed to bring this thing up. And maybe there is something like that internally, a scheme of a sorts, like that comes with experience that I haven't completely identified, right? So I would say like the first thing that came to my mind is it's really just naming your story too, right? I think that's not like a therapy tool. It's more of a very simple question. I would ask them like, hey, if you were writing a book, your personal biography, then what would be the name of this chapter? What's the name of the chapter before? What's the name of the chapter next? I think that's very powerful because they're able to, in their own words, summarize what's going on, right? And name it, right? Yeah. Some people are like, oh yeah, this is the darkness. Okay, so now we've externalized it, right? We've called it something, right? And then we're going to find purpose and meaning in it so that we also know what's the next chapter, right? So the next chapter is when I do this. So this gets them thinking. I love this question because I think because people love the questions, to hear the question, because this stops them in their track and they go, oh, yeah, what would I name it? Yeah. So that's something that they haven't considered yet up to that point, right? So that's one way that we might draw out a narrative, I guess.
Yeah. And I love that because it's looking at our story then as episodes. It's not just this is the thing that happened and I'm living with it for the rest of my life. Yeah. This was a season of my life, or this was an episode in my life, and I can name it something. That was the awful time. This was the desert season of my life where it felt like things were bleak. Yeah. But then I'm not there right now. And so it's a way of detaching myself. And it's like, I can speak to that part and that story. Yeah. I can view that story. I remember it like it was yesterday, but it's not where I am at this moment. And it's not where I want to be. And the story's not over.
And what's nice about chapters too is that in every chapter of a fiction book, there is a form of a mini resolution that happens usually. Within those chapters. Like there's a small win and there's a small loss, and then a what do I do now moment. And that's why you flip the page and want to read the next chapter, right? So when you put the narrative structures into your own life, it helps you to see there's a movement from where you were and where you're going still.
Yeah, I love that. I was chatting with a friend yesterday about that. I was sharing about some things that had happened a long time ago in my life. And she said, you know what? You wouldn't be who you are now if that had not happened. So like that little chapter was important, even though you wish you hadn't gone through it. It's shaped the way that you now look at the world, or the way that you relate to others, or it's given you that experience so that you can identify with others, right? Yeah. And it creates this like, in a sense, of richness or a depth to our character, depending on how we interpret that and how we bring it forward with us.
Absolutely. And you hear that all the time. Right, like people are just saying, like, I wouldn't be where I am now if it wasn't for that, right? So you hear that a whole lot.
Sometimes I think about my grandmother, who has now passed, but she grew up in the Great Depression, and there was just so much hardship across the board. Everyone experienced it, and the poverty, scraping to make ends meet or to get enough food on the table. And I think about how that entire generation had so much grit, right? Like so much toughness. And it's like no one would have wished for that to happen. And yet it created this depth in their character and this like well of resourcefulness and survivorship that happened as a result of that. So, I mean, I think in a smaller level, that can happen in our personal lives and our personal journey. It's the shaping of the diamond, right? That chipping away that can actually bring out our true character, and it can give us an opportunity to shine.
Yeah, going on a complete sidebar here. Like I'm just thinking about how, like in the last episode, we talked about how you need stories to build resilience in your chaotic life. And like nowadays, we're looking at these little quick reels and memes. I mean, they can hold stories in it for sure, but they don't give you that the story that you immerse yourself in to build that resilience. Like you need to hear stories of people who've gone through hardship and depression to not be completely scared of your mind of the direction of your country or whatever it is. So that's where stories come in. Like you need to hear and remember the hardships and how that shapes and make people resilient and how people face these challenges.
And I think resilience is a really important word here. How do you kind of help people to recognize their own resilience when they're telling their story?
Yeah, I mean, when I'm hearing a story, I'm always asking people a couple of things. Like, I want them to be very present with it because they're telling the story, and I'll say, "Hey, what are you feeling right now?" It's like, "Oh, well, I'm having this emotion." "Oh, can you tell me more about that?" Right? And they talk about their thoughts and feelings. So this is not very narrative therapy, more like CBT type therapy. But then they would say, what's the significance of the story? So that's where you're meaning making, right? You're adding purpose into that narrative. So I think that's part of it. When people share their stories and I'm able to say, this is what I'm hearing, what happened to you. So I share the story back to them. It's like, you went through this really, really difficult thing. And they would tear up and say, wow, thank you for saying that. You know what? No one's told me that.
Just that affirmation.
Yeah, no one ever told me that. They always tell me to tell me how to move on.
Yeah.
But for you to have heard my story, say it back to me, and frame it in a way where you saw the difficulty in it really helped me feel seen or heard. So there is that aspect of the narrative therapy, is to be seen or heard and cared for through it. And then you're also talking about things like, you did pretty well for someone who's gone through something like this. And again, it's like, I feel like I'm losing it, but thank you for telling me that.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's a part of the power of hearing and affirming other people's stories.
Well, and for someone to voice their story, it takes a lot of courage too. I'm only speaking about myself, the deepest wounds and the hardest times. I find it really challenging to talk to people about that. I'm very private, and there's a part of me that wants to hide it and save face. But, sometimes it's the appropriate time to share that with someone.
Yeah.
And I think in therapy, sometimes we've kind of gotten to the end of our rope, and that's why we're sharing it. So then to be in that place, it's very vulnerable, and it's hard to share that story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have less trouble sharing my stories. I can be pretty open and vulnerable even to strangers. It's in some ways a gift, really. And I had to learn that at a younger age, the importance of that for healing. And that's why I was so adamant to be that way. Because I wasn't always like that. But yeah, absolutely. I have people, they would say, I hate this that I'm sharing. I'm sharing this. I hate I'm even here.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, and then they share something with me and they're crying and they're like, thank you for bringing this up. Right. And
Yeah.
they're using that kind of like sarcasm with me, but which they can only do because there has been a built up trust that happened in the therapy room first. Right?
They feel safe.
Yeah. They felt safe enough. And there are times when people I've seen for a long time and then say, there's something I've been hiding from you. And like, as if they did something wrong. And I'm like, no, like, why would you share something with a stranger, right? But now that we're not, I know so much of your story. And that's why people do come back around, because they're like, my story. I feel the most comfortable with you, so I'm going to come back around and talk with you again. It's good sometimes to switch it up too, right? Like, people have gone to other therapists and came back afterwards too, and it's good for a season sometimes to just get another set of eyes on your story or another voice to add into it to get more richness. So there's nothing wrong with that too.
Yeah, and I think you've identified some of the bigger emotions that come along with storytelling too, is feelings of fear and shame. And a lot of times that's why we hold on to our story for so long and we don't share it with other people. Maybe we feel responsible for it, or we feel like that's not something that I should ever say to anyone. Or if I can somehow hide this thing that happened in my life, then maybe that's the best way for me to move on. And so then narrative therapy is a way of bringing that story to the light, and a third party can then help you to get some space from it so that you can release some of that shame and some of that fear that's happening.
Yeah. So one of the tools I use is we have a intensive session that is for sharing a story, right? And what happens is, instead of having just an open-ended tell me everything, it's very structured instead. And so we would get someone to write a timeline and go from start to finish. Very important, because you want to have a beginning and an end to that narrative, that chapter. And then we would have them write down the events of it in short form and close it up and say, don't visit this, not until we come back to a full session to go through this together. They come in, I time it. I say, here's 5 minutes to write half of it. So we have a middle point that we identify. They write down the story, and we're checking in every 90 seconds to make sure that their body is still relaxed. And then we stop for a small break and then go back to the second half of the story. So what's powerful about doing it this way is that it visualizes it in a timeline. So there's a very clear beginning and end to it. After doing the writing, I get them to draw it out in like comic book style. 6 frames, have a beginning and an end, and draw in all the stuff in between. So it adds symbolic mental pictures to add to this whole narrative as well. And then when they share the story with me, it's very straightforward. Here's the beginning, here's the middle, here's the end. And I'm able to now share it back to you and say, so and so did this, and this is what happened. In some way, it clinicalizes it. I don't know if that's a word.
Yeah.
but it does make it less of this just bleeding heart sharing of the story,
Right.
and more of a, this is what happened, here's some of the details. And they're processing it through it the whole time. The point of all of the 90 seconds and 5 minutes and 10 minutes, all those times that we put into it, the structure, is so that they never, ever in the whole session get overwhelmed by the memory. And that's very important, because if they're overwhelmed by it, then they're continuing to attach this really negative emotion to that season. Whereas if they're able to talk about it in a way that is not intense, healing happens. It actually becomes desensitized.
Right, because they can say, hey, I'm talking about this thing right now, but my body's relaxed. I've almost successfully detached myself from that emotion.
Yeah, I mean, one of the hopes, not freely airing your dirty laundry kind of thing, right? But one of the hopes is that if I have comfort sharing the story once, maybe I'll have comfort sharing the story another time, and maybe I can share it again.
Right.
And the more I'm able to share it, I can shape how I want to narrate it. I can shape how I see it, and also turn into belief for myself of what I took from this, that this did happen to me, it was horrible, and that I bounced back, and this is where I'm at. It takes away that intensity to it and the fear around even thinking about the story. And that's kind of the point, because after we finish a session like that, I would say, okay, now here's your papers. Go and do what you must with it. Are you going to burn it? Are you going to hide it somewhere? Are you going to read it to someone else? Do what you want. So a lot of people kind of like, oh yeah, thanks for that. I'm going to go and burn it. Right. And I'll say, like, just a word of warning, like, you are going to have more flashbacks and thoughts about and feelings around this event for the next 3 days, because we just made it very raw here. You just exposed it completely. That's the risk to doing an exercise like this. The benefit, though, is that after 3 days, it goes away. They feel a lot better about it.
Yeah.
Turnarounds happen for a lot of people. Sometimes drastic, like like the symptoms of anxiety disappears. Or something. Yeah, sometimes really, really drastic. Like, wow, I just have a really different outlook on life right now. That's, I mean, depending on the severity of issues or stories, that's how powerful this can be when I finally process it.
Yeah. Can people expect other side effects, I guess, that might be surprising, like exhaustion or trouble sleeping? What else comes along with this?
Yeah, I mean, I always tell people, like, hey, rest. We just did this really emotionally intense thing, so rest.
Yeah.
Like, give yourself permission to not do too much.
Right. Put your feet up and boil a kettle.
Yeah.
We're talking about externalizing our story and having the courage to share our story and detach from it a little bit or bring it outside of ourselves. I always love play therapy. I think it's a really good example of how kids can do this usually. Sometimes adults do it. But I remember working with a young person one time who was dealing with all of this emotional turmoil and struggling with the story, right? And one of the ways that we could really externalize that was by playing with those little people characters. So this person had little people characters and would walk them along and use their own name actually for that character. And it was just so natural, right, as a child to externalize those thoughts that were happening and saying, this little character is going to this place, but then ran into this person, and this person thinks this about them or is treating them poorly. And so then being able to like tell that story through the lens of this figurine that was being held. In some ways, as adults, I mean, we could use characters too, but in some way, by writing out our story, by drawing it out, we then become a bystander, a neutral observer of our own story. So then once our story's out there, how can we then use narrative reconstruction as a way to heal and move forward from our circumstances?
Well, I think we talked about it last session too, right? Like you're kind of just sharing the story in different perspectives, different. I was just kind of thinking about this when you're talking about how like that's why there's musical therapy, and that's why there's art therapy. People are externalizing their emotions, and like the saying of like the wounded person is the best artist.
Yes.
Right. That's why it's like showing all their mess out on paper or in their song, right?
Oh, I mean, I love Bon Iver, and his first album that came out, he had this traumatizing breakup and ended up in a cabin in the woods and then wrote this incredible album out of that sorrow, right?
Yeah.
So there's something just like so powerful about the raw emotions that accompany our story.
Because Taylor Swift was just in Toronto, I was just thinking about her old songs, the teardrops on my guitar.
Yeah.
Because you're 16 years old, you're having some real life issues going on, right? And laughing about it because it seems smaller when you're an adult, but of course when you're in it, really feels huge.
Exactly.
I wonder if those songs are cathartic. Do they help you, or do they keep you stuck there even more? I guess there's that danger to it. I'm not sure. I'm just thinking and reflecting out loud.
Well, and I'm curious about if some people's use of narrative therapy is actually taking that story and changing it. And is there a danger to that?
Oh, boy. I think any good thing can be distorted, of course. Like, we have this amazing ability to distort reality. Like, when someone has, we call it in couples therapy, a negative sentiment override about their spouses, I would ask them, how did you meet? And they would tell me this terrible narrative. We just kind of fell into it.
How romantic.
Yeah. Oh, I hated him from first sight. Really? And then you got married after. So like there's something that it's possible for you to actually paint a whole history in a way that's twisted almost.
Yeah.
Right. And that's dangerous too. I mean, is it the therapist's role to point that out? Possibly. Gingerly, of course, because we're speaking into people's stories and that's their story.
Yeah.
Right. This is what I'm hearing. This is how I'm hearing it. Maybe by permission, like, hey, there might be a way of looking at this way. Do you mind if I share? It is sensitive. You need a little bit of wisdom to know when to bring stuff up like that in session.
Right. And I mean, I'm thinking of very pop culture instances where this is happening to women who have been betrayed by their husband, sort of thing. And then the phrase that comes out is men are pigs. They say it, and then someone else says it too. So then they kind of band together with other people that have this negative sentiment override. And then it kind of clouds the way that you look at men or look at relationships. I'm not saying that's a wrong thing, but sometimes our distortion can then affect our future choices or the way that we look at, all men, when it was like one man was the one that hurt me.
Absolutely. Right. You're creating patterns in your mind. We're always doing that, right? And if you had a repeat experience a few times, it's very easy for you to say, then therefore all people or all this type of person is this, which is something we need to fight against actively. That's the root of racism. When you start looking at a people group and thinking they're all like this, and it becomes, we talked about this last time, what's the word again? The word sonder, right? That someone else is having this entire lived experience as rich as the one that you're experiencing. And my narrative can make someone else or a whole group of people dehumanized to a few traits, or yourself, right? I might see myself as just usually the word is the victim, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that in my entire lived experience, the people around me are only one of two things. They're either my hero that's going to save me, or they are the perpetrator of my pain.
Yeah.
So of course that's a distortion of a narrative, and that's going to completely change the way I act and behave and think about this world. And so it does need to be challenged and made flexible. So yeah, it's always both and. You gotta validate someone's lived experience and really believe that they have experienced things the way they have experienced it. On the other hand, it is just human nature that we distort reality for our needs, and not always to our benefit. And so that's why, because I care enough for you, I need to challenge that distortion, right?
Right.
That's very hard to do. I think especially for someone like me who's very non-confrontational. I hear this all the time. Sometimes the loving thing to do is to confront someone with something, right? So it's something that I personally need to work on and become better at, is like, yeah, you said this thing. Can I challenge it?
Yeah.
Is it really true? To be fair, like most people are actually very open to that in therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Because they'll be like, that's what I'm here for. If I'm not open here, where else am I going to be open? So there is a permission for a lot of people to do that.
I think it's tricky to do that without coming off as judgmental. But I think there's a reality that our story that we're telling ourselves and how we're interpreting it can then affect the way that we're treating other people.
Mm-hmm.
Or the way that we're approaching life even,
Yeah.
right? Like maybe we have that sense of entitlement or that sense of I'm the victim. So then we're always playing that card. And that actually does affect society. This is something I've just observed among people that are street involved who have faced severe traumas in their life. And what can sometimes happen is like a sense that the world owes me, or that it's everyone else's fault, it's the government's fault kind of thing. And there's a sense of blame, and it's just a very dark place. And I think as a therapist, because you care about your clients, you don't ever want them to get to a place where they're just so jaded and so stuck in that narrative that it's really hard to come out of it. So I think we're always trying to nudge people back on the straight and narrow, in a way of speaking,
Yeah.
or back to a place where they can feel whole again, and they
Yeah.
can feel healthy and feel ready to face life's challenges and have peace with the past and all those
Yeah.
things.
Well, we've talked about stories and how you have to have a hero and a villain in order to have a real story, and that usually a good story would end with some kind of resolution, where there's a submission of sorts from the villain to the hero and the hero to the villain. I think part of that narrative is that because we have internal conflict, that there's a hero and villain that needs to be worked out within me. So that it's like, you're telling me that everything in the world sucks, and that you really just want to disappear. But then there's this other part of you that wants to make friends, and that's feeling lonely. And so let's talk about that conflict, because I don't need to come in and tell you that's not true. You don't feel this way. Actually, you are already having that conflict. Yeah, right. So I just need to let's find some resolution here between those two sides.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's kind of a part of what your therapist is supposed to be able to do as well, is to name the internal conflicts and make you really let those parts duke it out a little bit.
Yeah, and let you get there on your own.
And validate the both sides, actually, right?
Yeah.
To say, like, there's good reasons why these two sides are there. And this is all a part of maturing. Mm-hmm. Is that when those two sides make some form of resolution with each other, so you have this new outlook.
Yeah, I love that. What would you say to someone who is using that victim word? I think that's one of the biggest pieces of narrative therapy, is that sense of the victim versus the perpetrator.
I don't think anyone ever calls himself a victim. Like they won't use the word itself, I don't think. So you kind of have to tease it out. I think what I do a lot of times is, like, for example, if I ask them, hey, what now? What needs to happen for this to become better for you? And then they would tell me a whole story of how everyone else needs to change around them. Then I'll just point that out. I say, have you noticed that when I asked you this question, everything that needs to change happens outside of you, right? So I'm just trying to gently bring them back to some ownership of, like, I want you to again recognize that none of that stuff is within your control. You can influence it, certainly, but what if that person never ever changes?
Right.
Then what then?
Yeah.
What are you going to do? So that is my way of gently pointing out that I'm living in a victim mentality.
Yeah, and it's like restoring personal power.
Yeah, and people have a really hard time with that, right? And that's what I'm trying to explain to them. Like the the only way you can have a sense of hope in life is if you feel like you can carve out the vision that you want and have a direction to get there. So I wanted to touch a little bit on not just past narrative, but future narrative, right?
Yeah.
So like it was a really popular book a few years ago, maybe a decade ago now, called Designing Your Life. And one of the tools they used is to get people to write out a 5-year narrative of a successful version of if they stayed in a certain job, or if that job were to not exist, then what would be another 5-year successful version of job number 2. And then in the hypothetical world of 1 and 2 not being impossible, writing out a third path. And so this is narrative, and it's really powerful again because people are like, oh, I've never like actually written it down and drawn it out. And it's building the vision for them of what they actually want. And then we start talking about the commonality between the 3 sides, because sometimes that usually happens. It's like, well, first I'm going to get the truck and the dog, and that happened in all 3 paths. Okay, so maybe that's really what's going to happen here.
Or at least it speaks to your values, even if it never happens.
Sure, yeah. Again, you have to keep shifting them away from this is how everyone else is going to start acting for this to be successful. Oh, really? Like, what about the path where this doesn't happen? That's impossible. What will you do then? So they are becoming the narrator again of their future and writing out their path, building imagination behind it and power behind it, that maybe this is possible. Because that's why I keep telling them, like, write the successful version of this. And then now you need to start taking the actual executive decisions and steps to make this a reality, right? Yeah. And that's obviously not easy for everyone.
It's not. And I think in a lot of cases, the story from the past or the present is often about other people and how they're affecting you. And sometimes it's really hard to take the step to detach from those people maybe that are harming us or that we're harming. That's the messy part of narratives, is that it's our story and it's everyone else's story kind of overlapping at the same time. So it's not just a cookie cutter, straightforward, easy out. It can be a long process. It can be a messy process. It can be full of hard choices and hard moves even. Sometimes people have to up and leave their current life and start fresh somewhere. And maybe that's going to be the thing that gives them that fresh start and that opportunity to move forward in their life.
Yeah. And sometimes the lulls in the story last a long time.
Yeah.
Right? Because like that's the downside of stories when you read books and when you watch movies, is that there's this huge resolution within 2 hours.
Right. Yeah.
Right. But that's because they're speeding up the events in a way that's not realistic, because we crave the resolution. But sometimes the resolution is really far off in real life, and we have to live in the low, I guess.
Yeah.
And just recognize that it's part of the story that needs to happen.
Right.
And I don't know if that's defeatist, but it's
realistic.
I think it's realistic in some ways. Of course, like the optimistic side of me is always like, well, what can you control? What can you do?
Exactly.
What are the only things you can control in this situation that you must focus on?
Right. Yep. Sometimes you got to work the crappy job or like put in the years of schooling before you can get to the thing you want to do. Yeah. You're just waiting a lot of time in life. And I think that's just normal, right? That's something that everyone experiences at different points in their life. And, sometimes it's about finding the little joys in those waiting seasons, finding the little moments of clarity or peace or happiness, and just enjoying those things. Sometimes we don't even end up where we wanted to go, but maybe it was for the better anyway.
Yeah, then you have to write the name of that chapter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Lindsay, thanks for coming in today. This has been Beyond the Session, brought to you by Reset Counseling and Psychotherapy. If you have any questions about today's show, if you have anything you want us to talk about on the air, you can email us at resetberry@gmail.com. And we'll see you next time.